They laughed when she first walked into the training compound, a figure so slight and small that most of the recruits assumed she had wandered in by mistake or had been misfiled into the wrong division, maybe even a clerk sent to deliver paperwork, but not someone intending to endure the merciless grind of military selection. Her boots were standard issue yet looked oversized on her thin legs, her uniform hung a little loose around the shoulders, and when she lined up in formation barely brushing 5'2", she looked like a child standing among hardened men who had the build of lumberjacks in the eyes of those eager to prove their worth. They cracked jokes behind her back and sometimes to her face, muttering that she wouldn't last a week, that the instructors would chew her up and spit her out before sunrise, that she'd never carry the packs, never survive the marches, never hold a rifle steady when her arms were as thin as twigs. She said nothing, and though she heard every word, she kept her gaze forward, her expression unreadable, the silence in her demeanor unsettling to those who paid enough attention to notice it wasn't the silence of intimidation but the silence of patience. The first days of training were brutal, 20-mile runs with no water breaks, push-ups until joints screamed, obstacle courses that broke down even the thick-shouldered recruits, but she never fell behind. Her steps were small but relentless, her breathing controlled, her body lean but efficient, and she moved with a rhythm that didn't waste energy. The instructors shouted, trying to break her, waiting for a crack to show, but when others collapsed she pressed on, drenched in sweat but unflinching, like endurance had been bred into her bones. The laughter slowly turned into irritation. No one liked being shown up, especially by someone they had dismissed as fragile. She was quiet in the barracks too, keeping to herself, polishing her rifle until it gleamed, cleaning her boots with meticulous care, eating in silence, never complaining about rations or sore muscles. The others bonded over shared jokes and stories of girlfriends back home or fights they'd won in bars, and they called her Ghost because she barely spoke, but when drills came, when targets popped up downrange, she transformed. Her rifle cracked with precision, each shot a whisper of finality, grouping so tight that instructors stopped pacing and leaned forward, murmuring to each other as if suddenly aware that something had slipped into their ranks without warning. Rumors started spreading that she had trained before, that maybe she wasn't as ordinary as she looked, that maybe her small frame wasn't a disadvantage but something sharper, more deliberate. By the time deployment orders came, no one laughed openly anymore, though some still rolled their eyes behind her back, refusing to believe she could carry her weight in a real fight, because combat wasn't just targets and drills, it was chaos, mud, blood, and terror, and they imagined she'd crumble under the first explosion. But then came the border conflict, a sudden insurgency that turned their unit from trainees into frontline soldiers overnight, and everything they thought they knew about her unraveled. The first ambush hit hard, machine guns from the tree line, mortars dropping dirt and fire across the convoy, screams rising as vehicles tore apart under shrapnel. Chaos ripped through the column, men diving for cover, some frozen in shock, but she moved like water, low and quick, rifle raised steady, eyes sharp as she picked off muzzle flashes one after another, her shots calm and deliberate in the middle of the storm. A sergeant who had mocked her weeks earlier watched in disbelief as she crawled forward through mud and debris, dragging two wounded men behind a rock wall with strength that belied her frame, pressing tourniquets on their legs before slipping back out into the open with a ferocity that didn't match her quiet barracks presence. She wasn't reckless, she was methodical, counting her rounds, conserving motion, hitting where it mattered. By the end of the firefight, when the smoke cleared and the enemy scattered, they counted more than a dozen bodies felled by her rifle alone. The men exchanged looks, unease gnawing at them, for laughter had turned to something else, respect laced with fear. She said nothing, wiped the mud from her cheek, reloaded her weapon, and prepared for the next order. Word traveled fast up the chain of command. Officers didn't laugh. They studied numbers and numbers didn't lie. Mission after mission, patrol after patrol, her record stacked higher. Clean shots from impossible distances, ambushes survived because she noticed the faint glint of metal before anyone else, comrades pulled back from death because she refused to leave them behind. In one raid, when the squad was pinned down by snipers on a ridge, she slithered through brush for hours, unseen, until she came up behind the shooters and ended the threat with a precision that made her squad mates stare at her as if she were something other than human. No one called her Ghost anymore. They called her Little Death, a nickname whispered rather than shouted, born not from mockery but from a dawning realization that she carried something inside her the rest of them didn't. Some avoided her eyes at night, unsettled by the calm way she cleaned her weapon, the quiet manner in which she listened to the darkness beyond the camp as if it were speaking only to her. The colonel first heard about her through reports, dry sheets of paper with numbers that seemed absurd, too high, too consistent, bordering on myth. At first, he assumed it was clerical error, but when he visited the unit to conduct a routine inspection, he saw her standing there among the others, that same small figure dwarfed by broad-shouldered men, her uniform still a little loose, her gaze still steady and patient. He thought it must be a joke until he opened the file, until he read line after line of confirmed kills, rescues, completed objectives that had saved entire platoons from annihilation. The room fell silent as he flipped the pages, the colonel's hands pausing, his lips pressed thin, the weight of the record settling on him as the others stood at attention. No one laughed anymore. The air was heavy with something close to awe, the realization that power doesn't always come in the shape people expect, and that the deadliest weapon on the field could wear the frame of someone everyone had once dismissed as too small to matter. The colonel had been in wars longer than most of the men had been alive, had seen rookies crumble under pressure, had seen seasoned veterans lose their edge, had read thousands of files filled with exaggerated numbers and inflated praise, yet as he sat at that wooden table in the dimly lit tent and turned each page of her record, the silence in the room thick enough to press against the skin, he realized that none of what he was reading was embellished, every number had been cross-verified, every confirmation signed by officers and commanders who had no interest in myth-making, and the kill count alone was staggering, more than triple that of the next highest in the unit. She stood there while he read, her posture perfect, eyes forward, not proud, not ashamed, simply steady, as if the numbers meant nothing to her, as if they were just entries on a ledger instead of lives erased. The colonel finally raised his gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly. As if trying to peel back the layers of her calm, searching for some flicker of ego or remorse. But there was nothing, only that patient stillness that made him feel like he was the one under scrutiny. He dismissed the others with a sharp gesture, and when the tent emptied he leaned forward, asking her if she knew what kind of weight those numbers carried, what it meant for the army, for the war, for herself. She simply nodded once, her voice low but firm when she finally spoke. She knew, and she wasn't finished. He found himself unsettled not by arrogance but by the absolute conviction in her tone, the quiet certainty of someone who had accepted long ago what she was and what she was willing to do. From that moment on she was no longer just another soldier in the ranks. She was reassigned, pulled into missions that required precision and a calmness under fire that most could never muster. She was sent to lead small units into hostile villages, to neutralize targets that intelligence labeled as untouchable, to disappear into mountains for weeks at a time with nothing but a rifle and a pack, and every time she returned, weary and mud-streaked, her eyes sharp and unsentimental, carrying the weight of new kills, new rescues, new victories. Her legend grew, whispered first within her platoon, then across battalions, until even soldiers who had never seen her began lowering their voices when her name was mentioned. Men twice her size avoided crossing her path, not because she was violent toward them but because her presence reminded them of how little their bravado meant when compared to the cold truth of survival. In one operation deep in enemy territory, when a convoy was ambushed on a narrow mountain road and pinned under relentless fire, she took command after the lieutenant was killed in the first barrage, rallying the panicked men with clipped orders that cut through the chaos, moving them into positions that turned the ambush into a slaughter for the enemy instead. Hours later, reinforcements found her standing over a line of bodies, smoke still curling from her rifle, her uniform torn and bloodied but her voice steady as she gave a report without embellishment, listing the dead and the saved as if reciting a grocery list. Some called her cold, others called her inhuman, but none could deny that without her, dozens more would have died. The colonel received reports like that one after another, each more unbelievable than the last, until he stopped questioning the numbers and started relying on them. He began to request her specifically for missions where failure was not an option, knowing she would not only complete the objective but do it with efficiency that bordered on surgical. He studied her from afar, trying to understand what made her different. She had no special background, no elite training before enlistment, no family history of soldiers, no medals prior to this war. She had simply walked in small and silent, endured the laughter, and then revealed herself as something forged in fire that none of them had seen coming. Yet even as her reputation solidified, she remained the same in the barracks. Quiet, meticulous, never boasting, never telling war stories around the fire, never seeking recognition. She cleaned her rifle, kept her boots polished, read whatever tattered books she could find, and slept lightly, always the first to rise. Her comrades began to watch her with a mixture of reverence and unease, for she was both one of them and something separate, bound by the same mud and blood yet untouchable in a way that made them wonder if she was born from the same world at all. Some tried to get close, tried to share jokes or invite her into their circles, but she answered in clipped sentences, her distance like a wall no one could climb. The colonel eventually summoned her again, this time not to confront her numbers but to ask her why why she kept going, why she kept killing with such precision, what she saw when she looked through her scope. Her answer was simple. She saw the enemy and she saw her comrades who needed to live, and nothing else mattered. He pressed, asking if she ever dreamed of the faces, if she ever felt the weight of the dead pressing on her shoulders, and she looked at him calmly and said the weight was real, but it was hers to carry, not his. The colonel, a man hardened by decades of war, found himself nodding slowly, realizing that for all his years he had never met someone who bore the truth of the battlefield so clearly. He dismissed her with an almost reluctant respect, and as she walked out of the tent, he knew that laughter would never follow her again, only silence, the kind that comes when men witness something they cannot explain, something both terrifying and necessary. The war dragged on, and with it came darker assignments, missions whispered about in the corners of the camps but never officially recorded, operations where deniability was as important as victory, and she became the soldier they turned to when others failed or refused, slipping into cities controlled by insurgents, eliminating leaders with a single bullet, dismantling networks piece by piece until entire regions fell quiet, and though her stature never changed, though she still looked almost fragile beside the towering men who guarded her during extraction, her reputation carried a weight that bent even seasoned officers into silence when she entered a room. The colonel received detailed accounts after each mission, always the same steady writing from field reports. Target neutralized, minimal casualties, squad recovered, objective complete, yet between those sterile lines was a shadow of what it must have looked like, the chaos of firefights, the smoke, the screams, and her moving through it like a blade through cloth. Once, when her unit was sent into a city to recover hostages, they found themselves trapped inside a maze of alleys with enemies swarming from rooftops, grenades bouncing off walls, tracers cutting through the night, and in that moment when men would usually break, she turned into something else entirely, her rifle snapping from target to target with unearthly speed, her voice calm as she gave orders, directing fire, covering retreat, carrying one of the wounded over her shoulders despite being half his size, and by the time the extraction helicopter roared overhead, the hostages were safe and the enemy lay broken in the streets. The men she saved that night whispered that she never flinched, never blinked, not once, as if fear had been carved out of her long before. The colonel began to see her as both an asset and a puzzle, a living paradox who embodied everything the military sought: discipline, courage, lethal efficiency, yet did so with no craving for medals or praise, only the relentless focus of someone carrying a burden they never put into words. He called her in again, one late evening when the air was heavy with the smell of rain and cordite from a skirmish earlier in the day, and asked if she understood what kind of legend was growing around her, how her name was spoken across units like a story told in firelight, half in awe, half in fear. She gave him that same measured stare and said legends didn't matter, only survival, only the men who came back alive because she had done what needed to be done. He pressed, asking if she ever wanted out, if she ever wanted to go home, and she tilted her head slightly as if the concept was foreign, and replied that the war was her home now. The colonel felt a chill at her words, not because they were dramatic but because they were spoken so plainly, without hesitation, as if she had long ago accepted that she belonged nowhere else. He began to realize that for all her lethality, for all the numbers that filled those reports, she was still just a soldier following orders, yet with each kill the line between following and becoming blurred. Rumors among the men turned darker as well, that she could see death coming before it arrived, that she could walk through a battlefield untouched, that bullets bent away from her, that her eyes could cut through walls, and though none of it was true, the fact that soldiers clung to such stories revealed the fear and awe she inspired. She carried herself the same way regardless, still silent at meals, still cleaning her rifle with obsessive care, still waking before dawn to run the perimeter alone, her small silhouette moving against the horizon like a shadow that refused to vanish. In another operation, they dropped her deep behind enemy lines with only 3 others, tasked with disabling an artillery position that had been pounding villages into rubble. The others expected not to return, but she led them through minefields, through trenches choked with smoke, dismantled guards with the swift precision of a scalpel, and when dawn broke the guns were silent, the position a wreck of twisted steel and lifeless bodies, and she guided the survivors back without a scratch. When they reported in, the general staff stared at the casualty numbers, enemy dead in dozens, friendly casualties 0, and realized that their smallest soldier had accomplished what entire companies had failed to do. The colonel received her again after that mission, his face lined with something heavier than pride, because though victories stacked, so did the weight of what she carried, and he could see in her eyes a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than muscle or bone, the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much, done too much, and could never fully return from it. He asked her if she ever wondered about the faces of those she killed, if she remembered them, and she looked at him steadily and said she remembered every single one, but she didn't see enemies, only threats removed so others could live. Her words lingered long after she left, and the colonel, for the first time in years, found himself unsettled, wondering if the war had created her or simply revealed what was already buried inside. In the ranks, laughter had long since died, replaced by silence and sidelong glances, and when new recruits joined, wide-eyed and boastful, the older soldiers told them quickly and firmly to hold their tongues when she passed, because whatever they thought they knew about war, she had already lived 10 times over. The colonel, hardened as he was, knew then that her story would not end in parades or medals, but in silence, the same silence that fell over every room when her record was read, the silence of men realizing they had underestimated not just her frame, but the depth of her resolve, and the unshakable truth that some wars are fought not by giants, but by shadows small enough to slip through the cracks and leave behind a trail of death that could never be ignored. The rains came heavy that season, turning the fields into bogs and the roads into rivers of mud that swallowed boots and wheels alike, and still the war pressed forward, endless, merciless, demanding men and women bleed into the soil until maps changed color, and in those months she became something of a ghost story not just among her comrades but among the enemy, whispered warnings that the small soldier with steady eyes could end a man before he even knew he had been seen, that squads disappeared in silence because she had been near, and it was in this atmosphere of fear that the colonel sent her on missions considered near impossible, testing not her limits, because by now he suspected she had none, but the limits of those around her. In one campaign the unit was ordered to retake a supply line that had been seized by an enemy battalion twice their number, and though the officers debated whether it was suicide, she volunteered first, her voice steady as ever, and when the plan was set into motion she slipped ahead of the main force, weaving through trenches and shattered houses until she dismantled the forward observation posts one by one, each rifle shot silencing a pair of eyes before they could raise the alarm, and by the time the larger unit advanced they found the path clear, the enemy disoriented, their lines already buckling from within. The colonel watched the reports come in from the field and realized that her presence alone reshaped battles, turned impossible odds into narrow but decisive victories, and though medals began to stack in her file she never attended ceremonies, never stood to be applauded. Instead she remained in the shadows, her only concern being the rifle she carried and the comrades she kept alive. Yet even among those comrades there grew a distance, a kind of invisible wall built from awe and unease, for they trusted her with their lives but feared her quiet, feared the way she never laughed, feared the coldness in her gaze when the firefight ended and she moved among the bodies without flinching, counting ammunition, preparing for the next engagement as though death were nothing but whether she endured. The colonel knew morale depended on stories, and in her case the stories were both boon and burden, for new recruits arrived with wild tales of the small soldier who could see in the dark, who could hear danger miles away, who could never miss a shot, and though she dismissed such talk, their wide-eyed reverence created a gulf between them that she never tried to bridge. He summoned her one evening to discuss this, to tell her she was becoming more symbol than soldier, and she listened without interrupting, her expression calm, before replying that symbols frightened the enemy more than numbers did, and if her silence, her record, her presence could keep even one more man alive, she would carry the burden of being seen as something inhuman. The colonel, hardened as he was, felt the weight of her words and wondered at the cost, for he could see shadows gathering in her eyes, not weakness but a kind of erosion, the toll of endless killing that etched itself into her soul like rain carving stone. Still, he sent her out again and again because the war offered no rest, and in one operation that stretched into weeks, her squad was cornered in a valley surrounded on all sides, supplies running low, men breaking under the strain, yet she moved through the chaos like a surgeon, rationing food, setting ambushes in the night, picking off scouts before they could close in, and when relief finally arrived the squad emerged battered but alive, carried forward on her relentless will alone. Stories of that survival spread far beyond the front, reaching even the capital, where politicians and generals debated what she represented, proof of resilience, a weapon to wield or a dangerous precedent, but she remained untouched by their discussions, a soldier in the mud, carrying her rifle, her uniform still a little loose around her frame, her boots scuffed but polished each night as though ritual was the only tether to something beyond killing. One evening, after a particularly brutal skirmish where she alone had held a ridge long enough for reinforcements to arrive, the colonel sat with her in the quiet after, sharing a flask more out of duty than camaraderie, and asked her if she believed she would survive the war. She did not hesitate when she answered no, that survival was not what she sought, that she had accepted long ago she would die with her rifle in her hands, and the colonel felt a chill move through him, for he realized she had no illusions, no hope of medals or peace, only a single unbroken line of duty stretching until it snapped. Yet still she rose the next day, still she marched, still she fought, and the men followed, for even in their unease they knew she was the one constant in the storm, the small frame with the endless resolve, the soldier whose silence carried more weight than any speech. The colonel, who had once laughed with others at rookies who looked too fragile, now found himself silent in her presence, humbled, because he knew that no matter how many reports he read or how many missions she completed, there was no way to measure the depth of what she had become, only the haunting certainty that the war itself seemed to bend around her, reshaping itself in the shadow of someone no one had believed in until the numbers spoke and the laughter died. The winter offensive brought a cruelty that even veterans had not expected, blizzards tearing across the mountains, frostbite claiming fingers and toes faster than bullets, supply lines shattered by snowdrifts and ambushes, and still the orders came to push forward, to hold the line, to take ground inch by inch, and it was in that merciless season that her legend hardened into something unshakable, because when others faltered in the ice, when men huddled in trenches and begged for reprieve, she moved with the same steady rhythm she had since the first day, her small frame wrapped in layers of frozen cloth, her rifle never far from her hands, her eyes scanning through sleet as though the storm did not exist. During one campaign her unit was tasked with defending a mountain pass that the enemy assaulted relentlessly for 10 days, shells raining down, machine guns stitching the snow with fire, men screaming as avalanches were triggered by the bombardments, and through all of it she became the anchor, moving along the line, pulling wounded back under cover, climbing out again and again to fire from exposed ridges where no one else dared stand, and each time the enemy surged forward she cut them down. With a precision so cold and merciless that survivors later told their officers the pass was defended by a demon, not a soldier. The colonel received the reports in the warmth of a command tent far behind the lines, and when he read the casualty lists, dozens of enemy dead, fewer than 5 friendly lost, he knew without needing confirmation who had held that line. He went to the front to see for himself, trudging through snow and mud until he found her perched on a broken wall, boots caked in ice, rifle across her knees, eyes fixed on the horizon as if already waiting for the next wave, and when he approached she simply nodded, no smile, no pride, only the acknowledgement of another day survived. He offered her praise, told her that what she had done would be remembered, but she shook her head slightly and said it would snow again tomorrow, and the enemy would return, and the dead would not care about legends. The colonel, a man who thought he had grown numb long ago, felt the sting of truth in her words, and when he looked at her thin frame, shoulders stooped only from exhaustion but never defeat, he realized that the laughter that had once greeted her arrival had been replaced by something heavier than respect. It was reverence, a recognition that she embodied something they could not name but depended on desperately. In the months that followed she continued to lead missions into the frozen dark, sometimes vanishing for days at a time with a small squad and returning with half of them wounded but alive, having struck deep into enemy supply routes, dismantled artillery positions, or rescued prisoners who had been written off as lost. Her record grew longer, the kill count climbing into numbers that made the colonel uneasy even as he signed off on them, for each confirmed death was another mark on her soul, another weight she carried in silence, and he began to notice in the rare moments of quiet that her gaze lingered not on the living but on the firelight, as though she were seeing something else there, faces or shadows only she could recall. Once, after a brutal raid, when the snow had finally stopped and the stars burned clear above the shattered ridges, he sat beside her and asked if she still remembered the first time they laughed at her, if she carried that moment inside her. She said yes, she remembered every word, every smirk, every sneer, and it had never left her, but it was not anger that drove her, only the certainty that underestimation was the greatest weapon she had ever been given. The colonel thought on that for a long while, realizing that her small frame had once been seen as weakness but had become the perfect disguise, a mask behind which a relentless predator waited. And now the army's deadliest soldier walked in the skin of someone still mistaken by outsiders as fragile. But inside the ranks there was no mistake anymore, no laughter, only silence when she passed, silence when her name appeared on a mission roster, silence when her file was read, because by then her numbers had passed into territory no soldier had ever reached in so short a span, and the colonel knew that history itself would struggle to contain her without turning her into myth. He wondered sometimes if that myth would outlive her, if when she finally fell the stories would grow until she was no longer human in memory, only a phantom of war, and he found himself both saddened and relieved by the thought, because legends endure where flesh cannot, and perhaps that was the only kind of peace someone like her could ever have. Still she remained unshaken, still she rose before dawn, still she checked her rifle, still she walked into storms with that same steady patience, as if nothing could erode the resolve that had carried her from the day they laughed at her to the nights when the colonel himself read her record in silence, unable to find words large enough to hold what she had become. Spring brought no relief, only mud in place of ice, the ground sucking at boots and the air thick with the rot of unburied dead. And though the snow had melted, the killing never slowed. If anything, it grew more savage as both sides sought to regain momentum, and in that shifting chaos she became the spear point of every assault, sent ahead to scout, to break enemy lines, to dismantle defenses before the main force arrived. Her presence so feared that intercepted enemy transmissions began to mention her specifically, warnings to watch for the small soldier whose rifle marked doom, and even the colonel, hardened as he was, felt a chill each time her reports came across his desk, because the numbers were no longer simply remarkable, they were bordering on impossible, a rhythm of death that read less like the record of a soldier and more like the march of a storm. In one operation her unit was ordered to cross a river under heavy fire to secure a bridge before it could be destroyed, and when mortars shattered the boats and men floundered in the current, she swam through freezing water with her rifle strapped tight, emerging on the far bank soaked and shivering yet steady, picking off gunners one by one until her squad could regroup, then leading the charge across the bridge with grenades tucked into her vest, her small frame darting between explosions as if the battlefield itself bent to her will. And by the time reinforcements arrived the bridge was theirs, the enemy retreating in disarray, their dead littering the span. Soldiers who witnessed it swore they had seen her rise from the water like a phantom, hair plastered to her skull, eyes blazing with focus, and from that day some began calling her the River Ghost, a name that followed her in whispers alongside the others, each moniker stacking until she was no longer a soldier but a collection of shadows in the minds of those who spoke of her. The colonel, uneasy with the deification, reminded her once that she was flesh and blood, that she could die like any other, and she simply nodded, replying that yes, she could die, but until then she would not be stopped, and he realized that arguing with her was like arguing with the tide. Her presence began to alter strategy itself. Officers built plans around her, factoring her precision into calculations, trusting that where she was assigned success was near certain, and though she never asked for command her influence outweighed the stars on their shoulders, for men listened to her in battle more than they did to their appointed leaders, not out of disloyalty but out of the raw knowledge that she would keep them alive. Yet beneath the victories there was an unspoken awareness of the cost, for each mission etched deeper lines into her, not on her face but in the way she carried herself, a stillness that grew heavier, a silence that lingered longer, and though she never complained, never faltered, some nights the colonel caught her staring into nothing, her jaw set, her rifle across her knees as though she could not let it go even for sleep. Once, during a brief lull in the fighting, he asked her if she could remember who she had been before all this, before the war, before the laughter, and she answered that she could not, that whatever girl she had been was buried under the weight of the record he read in silence, and that all that remained was the soldier. Her voice carried no bitterness, no sorrow, only the plain truth of someone who had accepted that transformation without regret. The colonel, who had seen countless men broken by lesser burdens, felt both awe and sorrow, for he knew that in her acceptance lay both her strength and her tragedy. Yet the war offered no time for reflection. Another offensive surged, villages burned, and she was sent once more into fire, her rifle cracking through smoke, her small frame weaving through ruins, her steady hands pulling the wounded back from death, and every time she returned the silence around her deepened, until even the colonel, who once had words for every soldier under his command, found himself without them when she stood before him, only the unshakable weight of numbers and the knowledge that history itself would not know how to tell her story without turning it into legend. Summer brought heat so oppressive that the air shimmered above the plains like glass, the stench of blood and gunpowder baked into the earth until men gagged with every breath, and still the battles raged, each day another contest of attrition, another desperate gamble for ground that seemed worthless until measured in lives, and she moved through it with the same unwavering calm, her uniform clinging with sweat, her hair cropped short and damp, her eyes sharp beneath the glare of the sun as though even the heat could not bend her resolve. And in that season her reputation reached its peak, her name spreading beyond the front to cities far away where civilians whispered of the soldier too small to lift a pack but deadly enough to end whole battalions. The colonel, seasoned and scarred, found himself called into meetings with generals who demanded she be used as a symbol for propaganda, a poster child for resilience, but he resisted, telling them she was no symbol, she was a weapon, and if they paraded her around for cameras they would dull the edge that had kept them alive, and though he won that battle he knew others would follow, for the hunger to make myths out of flesh was stronger than any reason. On the ground she remained unchanged, leading squads into ambushes, slipping through ruined factories to dismantle machine gun nests, dragging men twice her size out of collapsed bunkers with a strength born not from muscle but from sheer refusal to let go, and though her comrades no longer laughed, no longer doubted, they carried a kind of quiet dread in her presence, because they had seen what she could do and understood it was something beyond ordinary soldiering. In one infamous battle at the edge of a ruined city, her unit was encircled by 3 times their number, cut off from reinforcements, and for 2 days they held out against waves of attackers, ammunition dwindling, food gone, and when officers later asked how they survived, the reports all pointed to her, to the small figure moving through rubble like a wraith, her rifle snapping with each shot, her voice steady as she positioned men, ordered traps laid, shifted defenses with an instinct that seemed almost prophetic, and when relief finally arrived they found the ground littered with enemy dead, her own men bruised and bloodied but alive, clinging to the belief that without her they would have been wiped from the earth. The colonel read that report in silence, fingers tight on the paper, and when he met her afterward she stood the same as always, uniform patched, eyes steady, rifle clean, and he asked her if she knew what they were saying about her now, that she had become more than a soldier, that even the enemy believed she was some kind of spirit of war. She answered that spirits did not bleed and she had bled plenty, but it did not matter what they believed if it meant the men beside her had a chance to live another day. The colonel found himself staring at her small frame, remembering the first day when laughter had echoed through the barracks, and he could barely reconcile that moment with the figure before him now, a figure that seemed carved from the very essence of battle itself, and he knew then that nothing about her was accidental, that everything she had endured had forged her into the kind of weapon wars always demand but never deserve. Yet as victories piled higher so too did the silence around her, men lowering their voices when she walked by, officers hesitating to meet her gaze, even the colonel struggling to find words when she stood before him, and though she remained unchanged outwardly, inside him grew the gnawing fear that one day she would not return, that one day the silence in his tent would be filled not with her record but with the absence of it, and he wondered if he would feel relief or loss when that day came. Still, the war did not end, and still she marched, carrying her rifle, her pack, and the invisible burden of every life she had taken, a burden she never spoke of but that weighed on all who watched her, because they understood what it meant when the colonel read her record in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed, and they realized that no words could ever capture what she had become, only the unbroken rhythm of survival written in blood and fire across the fields she walked. The final push came in autumn, when the leaves burned orange and red and the ground turned slick with rain, a season that might once have promised harvests but now delivered only artillery shells and the endless roll of convoys toward the front, and by then her name was carved into every whispered story, her presence a living legend carried on the breath of soldiers who both revered and feared her. And when orders arrived for the regiment to take the high ridges overlooking the river valley, the colonel knew it would fall to her again, because the enemy had dug in with a ferocity that promised slaughter, and only someone who defied the rules of possibility could carve a path through. The climb was hell, mud sucking at boots, bullets snapping from concealed nests, men dropping into the muck with cries cut short, and through it all she moved as though guided by an unseen hand, darting from rock to rock, her rifle steady, her eyes cutting through smoke and rain, her voice sharp as she called for suppressing fire, grenades, movement left and right, always one step ahead of the chaos. Hours stretched into a day, the ridge creeping closer but never fast enough, and when dusk fell she led a small team through a ravine, crawling on bellies beneath barbed wire slick with water, slipping past sentries until they were inside the enemy lines, where she rose from the mud like something born of it and cut them down with the precision that had defined her since the beginning, each shot deliberate, each step forward unhesitating, until the ridge was theirs, the valley opening below, like a conquered kingdom. When dawn came the flag was raised, tattered but standing, and the regiment cheered though their throats were raw, their bodies broken, and when the colonel looked upon the survivors he saw her in the center, her small frame coated in grime, eyes hollow yet steady, her rifle cradled against her chest as though it were the only thing tethering her to the earth. That night in his tent he read the report as always, the kill record longer than any before, numbers that would have seemed fantasy if he had not known the truth, and once again he read in silence, the paper trembling in his hands, for there were no words left in him that could encompass what she had done, no speeches that could capture how a woman they had once laughed at had become the very spine of their survival. When he finally met her gaze she asked no questions, demanded no praise, only nodded slightly as if to say she understood, and in that silence lay an understanding deeper than anything spoken, the recognition that wars are won not by myths but by flesh that refuses to break. As winter crept back and rumors of armistice spread, the men whispered that if peace came it would be because of her, because the enemy could no longer stand against the ghost who stalked every battlefield, and when the colonel considered that, he realized that though her name might never grace statues or history books, every man who had walked beside her would carry her story until their dying breath. In the end, there was no grand ceremony, no parade, only the slow fading of guns and the uneasy quiet that follows, but for him the memory of those nights remained, the sound of rain on canvas, the flicker of lantern light, and the weight of the papers in his hands as he read line after line of a record too immense to speak aloud, his silence the only tribute he could give to the soldier who had defied every expectation. They had laughed once, he remembered, laughed at her size, her frame, the impossibility that she could carry the load of war, and he thought of that laughter now like a bitter echo swallowed by time, because it had been silenced forever the moment she carved her place in blood and fire, a silence that would linger long after the war was dust. And as he folded the last report, his hands lingering on the paper as though it might burn him, he accepted what he had always known but never said, that the story of the small soldier was not one of laughter but of awe, not of weakness but of strength unmeasured, and that when his voice finally failed him, the silence that remained would be enough, because it spoke the only truth that mattered. They had laughed at her small frame, until the colonel read her kill record in silence. The end.